This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and today I've got a super special guest in Beth Hall from Coach Hall Writes, and she's coming on to talk to us about how we can actually select evidence for our argument essays. So let's go get coached. All right, so super cool that we are visited here today by Beth Hall from Coach Hall Writes. If you haven't actually already checked out Coach Hall Writes on YouTube, you need to. And she graciously accepted my offer to come in here and teach me how to actually get my kids to find the correct evidence, or at least collaborate as we do it together. But I don't need to speak for Beth Hall. She can speak for herself. So Beth, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we're going to go right into things.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you. So my name is Beth Hall. I am an AP Lang teacher and soccer coach. That's where the coach comes from Arkansas. And I have a YouTube channel called Coach Hall Writes. I try to focus on AP Lang videos over there. And I also have a growing Instagram if people want to check that out as well. It's just at Coach Hall Writes. Just trying to help teachers and students as we navigate this crazy school year, getting ready for the exam.
For sure. Well, what I'm going to do here is this. We're going to actually talk about collecting evidence here today, but I'm going to share my screen real quick, because if you haven't actually checked out the breaking down the prompt video that I did with another friend of mine named Crystal La Liberty, you're going to want to check that out. You'll see a card up in the corner. But what I'm going to ask that you, I want to remind you that this is the prompt that we were using in that video, and we're going to actually use this prompt again today in order to collect evidence. So I'm just going to reread that with you all, and then we're going to let Coach Hall take over and talk about how she gets her kids to collect evidence and prepare to write an argument, and then I'll tag a little bit on at the end. But here's the prompt. It says, for decades, movies and music have included messages or labels to signal that they have material in them that some people may find troubling. Advocates for such things argue this is important to prevent people from being exposed to things that they do not want to encounter. However, Erica Christakis, a lecturer at the Yale Child Studies Center, says that free speech and the ability to tolerate offense are the hallmarks of a free and open society. Write an essay that argues your position on the use of warning labels or warning messages to signal potentially troubling content. And then, of course, there's all that bulleted information down below, but all it actually says is write a good essay. So that's what we do indeed suggest that you do. But before I actually tag on some information about what I do to get kids to select evidence, we're gonna let Beth take it away. So Beth, why don't you share your screen and walk us through, how do we do this? How do we gather evidence for a prompt that looks like this?
All right, awesome. So I'm just gonna share some slides that I put together. Hopefully I can make this so y'all can see it. So the first thing that I did when I first started this is I had to choose an acronym. And so there are several out there. If you go to the AP Lang teacher Facebook groups, you'll see chores and gopher, and I think pasta was one.
Truth be told, right, in education, what acronym has education ever turned down, honestly, right?
Exactly. So I chose chores because it seemed the easiest for my students to remember. But honestly, I don't really think it matters which acronym you choose, as long as you have one as a guide. So in case you're curious, chores just stands for current events, history, outside knowledge, reading, experiences, and science. So lots of stuff to remember there in some sense, but they're pretty self-explanatory categories. So that's the acronym that we've been using for a few years in my classroom. So once you have your acronym, then you need to brainstorm, or at least that's what we do when I'm teaching my students. So I actually like to have them brainstorm individually first. So they'll see the prompt, they'll write down chores or whatever other acronym they need to do on their paper, and they'll just start thinking about what evidence they can use. I've tried it both ways. I've tried having students do the thesis first and then the evidence, and that worked for some students, but for most of my students, the evidence first and then the thesis, even though it seems kind of backwards, actually leads to a stronger essay for them. So I've been doing it this way with some success for a couple years now.
So I want to just chime in just real quick, because I think that's actually an important move to make a lot of times, because a lot of times we have gut reactions to kind of an argument, and that's a good thing to have, right? But when we then want to just jump in with our gut reaction, typically there's a lot of emotion that's tied there. And when we want to have a really solid argument, we want to make sure we have evidence to back that up. That's not just emotionally motivated. So I actually think that sounds like a really strong idea to gather evidence, even if they have an initial reaction, to gather evidence. Now, just one real quick question here, right? When you have your kids kind of brainstorming individually, what's the biggest kind of interruption that typically comes up the first time that they do this? Do your kids have a typical struggle the first time that they actually start using chores?
I think it kind of depends. So that's what I have the second bullet point there, because I have a lot of questions from students the very first time they do it. They're like, okay, do I need to have an equal number of entries for each letter? And I tell them no, because I quite frankly don't care that it's equal. I just kind of want them to start thinking about stuff. And sometimes, depending on the prompt, you might not have, like, let's say reading, you might not have a lot of evidence that supports that, and that's okay. And also they ask, like, do I need to have an entry for all the categories, or can I skip one if I don't have any ideas? And I tell them that's fine, because it's really not about having like the everything filled out or like equal numbers. It's about just kind of getting the ideas on paper. And of course, you'll have a couple students who are like, oh, I can't think of anything. And, I just kind of tell them, you got to write something.
Yeah.
And there's always personal experience. Now, when I first started teaching, I told my students, like, don't use personal experience, but because it's not always convincing. Now I'm more open to it. I've made a shift. But the one thing I tell them I don't want to see, if at all possible, is I don't want to see hypotheticals, because those are not very convincing.
Right. I tell my students all the time, hypotheticals suck, right? And it just so happens that most of my kids, are the first time that they start writing out their evidence, they always bring me to a hypothetical. And I'm like, all right, guys, whoa, you got to chill out here. Just one other note about the that kind of personal self as evidence. Some prompts are tailor-made for that. Other prompts are not. And it's really important that the kids, kind of look for that. But one other element about that is that I've, in my body paragraphing video that will come out later next week, I'm going to give an example of a body paragraph that actually has a personal example as an effective piece of evidence. But I do agree that if you can use something that is not just saying, I live in my own little world and that's all I know, it is better to pick something out that's going to be a little bit more academic. But we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So pardon my interruption. I do appreciate that, but I think that these are some issues that a lot of people kind of run into, and even kids, right? And the acronym is a great springboard to get past those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Because honestly, our students are different too. So a lot of my students in AP Lang do take APUSH. And so if they take AP US History, they're usually, depending on the prompt, able to tie it to some sort of historical event or something. Obviously not all prompts are like that, but the students who come from maybe like an on-level history class, or maybe like a less like rigorous class, they might not have as much like specific evidence, which we could talk about later. And so sometimes for those students, the personal experiences, if they're relevant, I mean, that's the key word, but if they're relevant, they are more convincing. I remember I had a student who, she's playing college softball now, and we were doing the unknown prompt, and like all her peers were talking about like these different like historical examples, and she's like, Coach Hall, like I don't know any of this stuff. And I was like, okay, what do you know well? And she's like, softball. And I'm like, okay, what's the unknown in softball? And she just went off like spouting all these different examples from like personal experience and the Olympics. And I was like, okay, so you do have evidence there. It might not be the same as the people sitting next to you, but you're not writing their essay, you're writing yours. And I think that kind of mentality really helps.
Now, a quick question here, real quick, just because of the way that you told that little anecdote. Do your students actually call you Coach Hall?
Yes.
Oh,
I don't know
that's
if it's
incredible.
Like a Southern thing, but like, if you're a coach, at least in the South, I guess, then you typically get called coach, like even like, so they don't call me Mrs. Hall. Like they think that sounds weird.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I don't know if it's like that elsewhere in the country, but yeah, it's like it was actually kind of like a badge of honor the first time like I got, because I was hired as a teacher first, and then I became a soccer coach. And when the kids started calling me coach, it was kind of like, okay, I like this.
That's it. Oh, that's great. That's great. So once again, part of my interruption, but I appreciate, the clarification there. And maybe I can start getting my kids to call me coach. I don't know. They'd look at me and they'd be like, shut up. And then they'd walk out of my room. Anyway, so sorry for that interruption one last time.
No, it's totally fine. Okay, so this third step here, this is something that I started doing, I think last school year, because my students were choosing a lot of general evidence. And I looked at the rubric, And I tried to show them row B, okay, let's pull out the keywords in this rubric.
Now you're talking about the rubric that we're using, the standardized rubric that's used by scoring
Yes.
on the AP exam, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're in row B, of course, yes.
Okay, so the College Board's rubric, I had them pull out kind of like keywords, and they pulled out like generalized evidence, somewhat specific, and specific. And of course, we want specific evidence because it's more
Yes.
convincing. So what I had them do is after they did chores, I had them go through and label each entry. So if they could give me like generalized evidence of it, they would put a G. If it was somewhat specific, then they would put an SS and then an S for specific. And that was all up to them. Like, so it, like their own interpretation of it, like play to your strengths, I guess, is kind of the methodology here. So
Yeah.
for student A, like they might talk about something and they might be able to be really specific about it, but student B, it might be generalized. So it's just kind of getting them to sort through their evidence a little bit and favor the evidence that's more specific.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
So just to give an example based on like the prompt that you had showed earlier, let's just say like for generalized evidence ratings, like
Yeah.
that really vague there.
Media ratings, right? That is.
Like,
are we rating food? Are we rating? Who knows what we're rating? Absolutely.
right? Is it like 2 thumbs up? Are we talking 5 stars? Is it
Yeah.
PG-13? Like what is ratings?
Yeah.
So that would be really general. And of course, some students, that might be the initial thought process. Like after reading the prompt, they might think, oh, okay, ratings. Well, we can actually build to something a bit more specific. So somewhat specific might be movie ratings. I kept it really simple there, but you could kind of expand on that.
Yeah.
And then a specific piece of evidence, I found a Forbes article that was talking about how like the movie Frozen is rated PG, but like it's actually a lot tamer than movies from the 90s that were rated G.
Even more so, I don't know if have you ever seen the movie The Black Cauldron?
I think maybe not the whole thing, but I know what you're talking about.
Because I think that's an 80s movie, and I'm pretty sure that was rated G. And oh my gosh, I can't even believe what goes on in that movie. So yeah, I totally understand where this is going.
Yeah. Like the article was talking about how like in The Lion King, there's like, you know, they're eating like a dead animal carcass, and
Right.
like that's like not exactly kid friendly depending on your age.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, I thought that was interesting. And you could actually take this evidence and maybe use it differently depending on what your thesis ultimately is. Like maybe we are becoming softer as a culture, or maybe we're doing the right thing by changing the ratings a little bit. So you can kind of like go either way with that, but that's much more specific than saying ratings.
Right. And, you know, and also, you know, we've got those specific examples of The Lion King and Frozen. And, you know, we could even get even more specific by talking about the kind of, you know, violent images from The Lion King, and then the images that are considered violent in Frozen that aren't half as vicious. That's a great example of trying to get kids there, and, you know, even getting them to recognize, hey, maybe even though I just thought of ratings, I can give them a scaffold to say, oh, good, can we get a little bit more specific? Can we get even more specific? And then really trying to push kids to write with specificity. That's a great idea.
Yeah. So when students tend to only give like general answers, because part of this is it's like bullet points on a piece of paper. And so they might not be able to go as in depth the first time. So I like this idea of, okay, let's take a general idea and make it somewhat specific, make it specific. But as they get like more practice with this, they can, like, I've had kids write like, I don't know, American Revolution. And to me, that's really general, obviously. But then like, if I ask them, okay, but what would you talk about the American Revolution for whatever prompt we're doing?
Yeah.
And then they'll be like, oh, okay, well, this person did this and there's this law. And like, so they can maybe just do a bullet point, but as long as they know that they can be specific about it, I don't necessarily have them like plan every single thing.
Right.
Because this is really like a quick thing in class. Like they'll do it independently. And then I like to shift to whole class, or at least like in a normal year with face-to-face instruction, we shift to whole class, because then they can hear each other's ideas. And usually someone will say something and then everybody will be like, oh yeah. And then they'll like add it too, because they just didn't think of it the first time.
Right. Yeah. And that is kind of nice to have there as well. So yeah, that works out really well.
Yeah. So then what they do, at least like what I've tried in the past, is they'll look at their evidence that they've labeled like specific. So they put an S by it. And if they can pull maybe like 3 to 5 examples, pieces of evidence, whatever you want to call it, that they gave an S, that's usually going to be the evidence that ends up in their paper. Not always. And sometimes I have had students need to use like the SS category, somewhat specific, because they just didn't have enough or something happened. So, I mean, it is what it is. But when they're kind of like narrowing down their evidence, I ask them to, first of all, make sure that their examples are appropriate for the task. And then secondly, we want to figure out like, what is the like relationship between these pieces of evidence? And is there any kind of like line of reasoning? Because they might have a couple things that they know a lot about, but they might not be like related at all. So it might be too big of a jump in the line of reasoning. So some of the things that I have them look for might be chronological order. That typically comes into play with like history or current events. Cause and effect, maybe similar or contrasting causes or outcomes. And then like maybe a progression of ideas going from like small scale to large scale. Like personal to universal or vice versa, depending on the examples. You could totally flip that order if you wanted to.
And that would be a great way to also teach transitions too, because if it works chronologically, let's get the chronological language in our topic sentences. If it works on a cause and effect, and that can actually help them, if they think about their evidence, that's going to help them not only formulate the order of their thesis, but also their topic sentences and the essay itself too. These are excellent points for thinking about how to arrange evidence and then produce the essay itself.
Yeah. And those questions, like you can ask them, they might not understand line of reasoning super well. I think even some of us AP Lang teachers were kind of like, okay, yeah, we get it, but it's hard to explain.
Yeah.
But you can ask a kid like, okay, let's say you're going to talk about the American Revolution and World War II. You know a lot about both for whatever prompt this is. Well, which one would you talk about first? Because they can go in the same body paragraph. Well, they're going to probably say American Revolution. And if you ask them why, they'll be like, well, because it happened first. And so just getting them to realize those nuances. The same for when kids bring up like personal evidence, because that can sometimes be tricky to know where to place that in the argument.
Right.
So like, are you going to lead with that and then go to this like broader example from like, I don't know, current events or history or something? Or are you going to start broad and go to more specific? Because those topic sentences are really important. That idea of like transitioning from paragraph to paragraph.
Absolutely.
So this helps them as they're narrowing it down to like 3 to 5. Because I don't know that you could really choose more than 5. I think that would be
that's too much for 40 minutes. Of course,
no.
I completely agree.
So 3 to 5, just because some of them might be related and they might go in the same paragraph or whatever. So 3 to 5, but getting them to figure out, okay, what can I write about effectively? And specifically, is it appropriate for the task? Which, I mean, usually it is, but I think you and I can both name some topics that we've seen kids write about that are not appropriate.
Yeah, I will talk about some of that evidence soon enough.
Yeah. So then like, what's my line of reasoning? Because I think if we're going with this idea of planning the evidence first, like brainstorming it and then working back to a thesis, we want to have that line of reasoning starting to like form a little bit in this planning process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think too that that it also can help kids to realize that they might have to change their thesis if they realize they have more evidence to support a different position. Then they should probably support that different position, at least on the essay to write a better, on the exam to write a better argument, as opposed to then they can then rethink about it in their lives a little bit later. You know, you're not glued to the position that you write about on your AP Lang.
Yeah, absolutely. Because otherwise it feels really forced sometimes. You like, oh, I wrote this great thesis, but then I don't really have the evidence to back it up. And my students, I had a kid ask once, he's like, because I said, you don't have to argue what you truly believe. Like, they're not going to know. And he's like, are you sure? And I was like, I promise you.
The AP police will come knocking on that door, right?
I was like, nobody's going to know. Our school does pay to have the essays sent back, like in a normal year. So I was like, technically, like I might know, but I'm not going to like come and hunt you down. And because, I think sometimes kids sort of have it in their head that like, there's this like answer they're supposed to give. And, and I don't know, I could kind of see where that line of thinking comes from, but like at the end of the day, your job is to be convincing. Like it doesn't really matter what you argue because your reader's supposed to be unbiased. We're just looking at like, did you complete the task and how well? So it's, now that being said, like there are times where, we want to rein it in a little bit, but I've had conversations with students because they were so worried that like the AP police were coming, and I was like, nope, not a thing.
No such thing. They don't even exist. So, no, that works out great, especially thinking about the ordering of this and the picking of it. Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's it for my slides. I'm just
yeah.
gonna stop sharing, I guess.
Yep. And what I'll do is I'll bring up mine. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually, I'm going to piggyback off of what you had to offer because it's excellent. And what I want to look at here, though, is I want to look at the, okay, I think I should be sharing my screen. Do you see my screen up there?
Yes, you're sharing it.
Gotcha. What I'm going to do is this. I'm going to just go over here, right? I do have my kids select evidence in a very similar manner to yours. I have them change the acronym just a little bit because, like I said earlier, there's no acronym that education doesn't love. But you're going to notice that I've got this image right up here on my screen that just is called the strongest human argument. And the reason why I have this here is because one of the things that I introduce to my kids is that when they produce their evidence that they're picking out, I really want them to think about their audience first, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because, I mean, they could pick out whatever evidence they want, but if they don't think about their audience and who they are and their backgrounds and their values and their beliefs and their needs and their wants and desires, then the essay is not going to be entirely effective. And one of the examples that I have is a few years ago, there was a prompt that was given out about the value of the unknown. And I had a friend who was reading it and he was like, I've read so many essays that use Finding Nemo as an example. And although Finding Nemo might fit as an example, first of all, it's fiction. Second of all, it's a children's movie, and this is an AP exam, right? So I actually have my kids, before they pick their evidence, I have them start by thinking about who their audience is. And the reason why is because they do this in their life as well, right? They don't just go in and say, Mom, I'm going to the movies tonight. You can't do anything about it. A lot of times before they make their claim, they need to kind of prove that they deserve to go to the movies that night so Mom and Dad won't fight about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this because it's tied into the AP Lang standard, because I bring this up a lot with rhetorical analysis, like with, the speaker and the audience, like what is the audience's background or shared values? Because, with rhetorical analysis, the writer tailors it to their audience. Right. And they make rhetorical choices. So I love this because it's basically teaching students, hey, now you're the writer, you have an audience, you have to make rhetorical choices, and maybe Finding Nemo is not the best example.
Right, especially for the AP exam. So what I'm going to do super quick is I tell my kids, your AP readers, when we think about their backgrounds, values, beliefs, and needs, I'm like, guys, let's talk about this, right? Now, I'm going to mention things in an entirely holistic manner. So if there's any teacher watching this and you're like, that's not me, well, that's okay. We're thinking about things holistically. But when I think about the backgrounds of AP readers, we know that they're either professors or AP teachers. So they're well-educated individuals, right? They clearly value education. And because they're teachers, they most likely value civics as well, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing too, is that I tell kids all the time, especially because I work in a rather conservative district, I tell kids, look, you can write whatever argument you want, but you need to be prepared for the idea that nationally, teachers are on the whole collectively more moderate to liberal. Mm-hmm. And because of that, you need to think about if you're going to have an argument that is more conservative in nature, you need to you don't change your laurels here or your morals about that, but you have to think about evidence that somebody that might disagree with you actually accepts, because this is going to be the case. And I'm like, and if the person already agrees with you, if they hold the same kind of, mindset that you have, they're going to agree with your evidence anyway, especially if it's stuff that the opposing side would accept. So I always try to get kids, if you're doing this for AP readers, right? Who's your audience? Educated individuals, they care about civics, potentially more on the politically liberal side, and they really want to see your reasoning and your ability to engage with the world around them, around yourself. Mm-hmm. And I bring that up too, because how you had mentioned earlier that you kind of were leaning away from that kind of personal experience. It's not bad to include, but you don't necessarily want your entire essay to have that, unless the essay really has an opportunity to have that. Like the value of the unknown prompt, you could write an entire essay about yourself and use multiple examples and have it score very high. I completely agree with that. But that's the first place where I start with my kids.
Yeah, I agree. I had to have similar conversations with my students, not recently, but a couple of years ago, teaching in Arkansas. You can imagine that students are a bit more conservative, not all
Yep.
by any means, but, I had to tell a student, hey, the Bible might not be the best evidence for this particular prompt. Not saying you are wrong or right or anything, but, and I also told them like, hey, politics might not be the best thing to bring up either. Like, just because sometimes it can come across in a way that you don't intend. So
Right.
just, I don't know, it was awkward to tell that to kids, but I had to be very honest with them and they appreciated the tip. And I said, like, I'm not telling you you can't, but I feel like it's my job to caution you. Just
Right, absolutely. And there are times when these examples work perfectly, but kids really have to set it up in that way, as opposed to just being like, I'm going to just commonly accept that you think that this is entirely valid. And so it's right. It's about getting them to make choices about who their audience is collectively on the whole, right?
Mhm.
Not everybody lives in Arkansas. Not everybody lives in Massachusetts. And now we have to try to say, how do we reach the broadest audience? And what do we know about the broadest audience on the whole? So the next thing that I have the kids do is I get the kids to think about the prompt, and they haven't even written their thesis for me yet, but I say, what do you want your audience to understand about your feelings about this prompt? So kind of, you had a gut reaction. What do you want your audience to understand? And they'll write that out in a little simple sentence. And then I'll say, great, now you're going to take an acronym and you're going to try to pick out your evidence that your audience will accept that you can then actually illustrate or support with this evidence. And that's actually going to lead me to the next slide that I'm going to show in just a moment. But after the kids pick out evidence, I then say, okay, now you need to write out, what do you want your audience to do? Because that's going to be your conclusion, but that's for a different video. So I make them go through these questions first, but this third bullet point here, you're going to notice that as I shift over, right? What I do is I go back to their planning. And once again, I had a planning video that you can actually see up in the cards right above my head. And when I had the kids break down the prompt, I have them identify the positions and assumptions that show up in the prompt. And I also have them kind of mark whether they initially agree with that or not, if they think that they can have evidence to support that, kind of like what you do with general evidence, somewhat specific evidence, and specific evidence. And then I give them, they think about their positions and all of the information in the prompt that was given to them. And then I give them this little organizer. And I appreciate our conversation the other day, the organizer with the wrong image in it, my bad. But I appreciate the conversation you and I had the other day when you were bringing up this idea of general, somewhat specific, and specific, because that is the language in the scoring guide. And I have my kids remember their acronym. It's just one letter, S. It's just S cubed, right? All of their evidence can come from their subjects that they learn in school, elements of society. Underneath my little copy and paste right here, it says mass media and sports, by the way. So subjects, their society, and their self, right? They could talk about personal experience, secondary anecdotes, and at all costs, I ask them not to use hypotheticals, but sometimes they just do. And so when we think about the prompt that we're looking at, if we're talking about movie ratings, I actually have an example here of me picking evidence for a movie rating where I've got society, this is mass media, and I listed it as somewhat specific. And I said media ratings. So on yours, you put ratings. I said media ratings on movies, video games, and music. What's nice is that if we can get kids to at least identify the somewhat specific, that's what they can put in their topic sentence, right? So we could say, hey, your topic sentence has to be an indicator of what you're going to specifically talk about in your body paragraph. So we have this nice little organizer here. They're like, okay, I'm checking off something from the box so it will work. I can label it somewhat specifically. And then they go on to describe it in true specifics here. And you'll notice that I'm talking about Netflix and Enola Holmes. And then I always click down here and I say, okay, is it acceptable for your audience? Yes or no? Why or why not? And if they check the no box, they know that they're going to most likely have to take that evidence out. Now, if I have a student who does indeed have, a piece of evidence and it's like, this will work, but I don't think it's audience appropriate, but I know I can make it work. Kids are their own writers, but we're just trying to prepare them to say, hey, listen, we just want you to be as specific as we can, and we want you to be as purposeful as you can as well. And I just have another one here. When I was thinking about ratings on things and how people can get offended and not endure things, right? I also have that moment when Starbucks turned their Christmas cup from having a tree on it to red, and everybody flipped out. And there was this huge war on Christmas, and I was like, whoa, I didn't realize people were going to respond like that. I don't think Starbucks necessarily did either. And something that was supposed to be inclusive became rather divisive, not necessarily on purpose. And so I've got these examples in here just as examples of, charts that you can give kids that kind of use that language from the chart. And we want to get kids all the way in the right-hand side as they write on their essays itself. But that's the only difference that I have. If you look at chores, you could put all of what chores stands for right into any of these S's here. I just typically stick with that one letter only because on a high stress situation, I'm like, hey, maybe if the kids can just remember one letter, we're good,
Yeah, absolutely.
So please note, folks, I'm in full support of what Coach Hall does. I got to tell you, Beth, right? Every time I think about your first name, I'm like, it's just Coach Hall, and being in support of that, I do things just a little bit differently by introducing that audience as being a unifying factor of that evidence, right? But honestly, I think you combine these two methods and you've got a solid way of getting kids to plan out evidence for their argument papers to get them to be as specific writers as possible. So before I sign off here, Beth, is there anything else you want to add?
Honestly, I think we covered it. I think we gave people, a couple of different methods to narrow stuff down, but I think the key is just practice and modeling it with students, because
Absolutely.
even though they might have done arguments in previous classes in younger grades, the expectations for AP are a little bit different. So just kind of modeling it. And I mean, I personally teach synthesis before argument, but that's partially because of a state reason. We have the synthesis is for our school, it's their mock exam. So I don't really think you could go wrong either way, but just reminding them that, argument is a very integral part of the course. So whether you do argument then synthesis or synthesis then argument or whatever, obviously rhetorical analysis has to go in there somewhere, but getting kids to realize that part of what we're trying to do is learn how to construct a coherent, logical argument. And that really does come down to the evidence to an extent.
No, absolutely. Right. And actually correlating that evidence to make sure that it actually flows together. I remember I once had a kid write about, certainty and doubt. And he talked about Deflategate with Tom Brady because I'm in Massachusetts. And then he talked about Magellan. And I was like, his argument was great. He was like, certainty and doubt are inversely proportionate. And I was like, wow, that's a great relationship. But the examples don't really correlate. Could you have given me Magellan and Galileo? Could you give me Magellan and Darwin or something like that? And he chose Deflategate and Magellan. And so trying to establish that correlation was a little bit hard. But I am incredibly grateful that you decided to join us here today. Hopefully you'll be able to do something together again. And it was an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
So those are just some ways that you can actually work on selecting evidence through acronyms and kind of organizers and planners. At the Garden of English, one of the ways that you can actually support us is by picking up some of the posters that we offer, and you're going to notice that I'm going to put a couple of the images on the screen, probably like here, here, and here, depending on how I can get them to edit and pop up. But we do have posters that really help kids focus on picking audience-centered evidence and pertinent evidence that will relate to claims. You don't just have to buy posters in order to support the Garden of English. In fact, the easiest way you can do it is by pressing subscribe and then perhaps even sharing our video. You can always follow us on Facebook. You can also like us on Instagram and follow us on Instagram. And once again, you can just watch the videos and try to get something from them as well. Tell people word of mouth. That's how they used to do it in the old days, the days when I was a kid. So anyway, thanks for joining us here. Another huge shout out to Coach Hall for giving us some excellent information on how to get kids to pick their evidence. And I hope that I see you all soon as we continue our argument unit. Our next video will be probably about outlining the argument, and then we'll move to body paragraphing. So you all have a great one.